And welcome back to Reason and Theology, doing another show here on the topic that has been debated quite significantly recently. Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? We're joined by Dr. Thomas A. Bogardus, who has a presentation that he's going to go over for us, exploring this question. Also joined by Louis Dizon, who is here and is going to ask some really helpful questions. Of course, y'all are also welcome to ask some questions in the chat, but maybe hold off towards my prompting of you guys to um, ask some questions towards the end of the presentation. I'll let y'all know in the comment section when you should start doing so. But yeah, Thomas, really excited to have you. Such an honor. And I understand you got a PowerPoint presentation. So if you want to go ahead and share that, let's dive in because I know we're up against the clock and I'm ready to dive in.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for inviting me. I have never shared my screen in
No worries.
StreamYard before, but I'm going to do my best.
Yeah,
Okay,
hit
share
the
screen.
little plus button there. It should be a plus button. Um,
Okay.
and then click on the one that says share screen. And then you'll need to select most likely entire screen and choose the screen in question
Okay.
or the window or
How does this
yeah,
look?
I think
That's
that
working?
yep, sure is. I can see it now. Good deal.
All right. So, yeah, I'll share some thoughts about my own view. And I also collected some objections that I've heard recently on the internet and elsewhere. And then I guess maybe the audience will have some questions or objections. So I welcome those. I wrote a paper on this back in 2017. Didn't quite get to the bottom of the issue, but it's been nice to have another chance to think about it and feel like I'm getting a little clearer on what's going on. So I'll try to share a little bit with you about what I'm thinking these days. So question is, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? And I'll just tell, I'm not going to bury the lead here. I'll tell you my answer. I think probably yes. Probably yes. There's a chance the answer is yes. If we wanted to put it a little more carefully, a more nuanced answer is, I think it's likely that many Muslims and Christians worship the same God, but I think it is possible that some don't. And not just possible, but sort of plausible. I think there's good reason to believe that some Christians and Muslims aren't both referring to God. So what this depends on, I think it's actually a really sticky issue in philosophy of language having to do with reference shift. So one thing that I hope we could disabuse the audience of is the notion that the answer to this question is easy, like in either direction. Some people, when they enter this debate, they think obviously yes, Muslims and Christians are worshiping the same God. But I've also seen videos on the other side where people think the answer is obviously no. I think I've told you what I think the answer is, but most of all, I just think it's a really difficult question to answer. And that's something that I think philosophy can help us with, answering difficult questions. But even before that, like clarifying what exactly the question is. So I'll try to do both of those things. I'll try to clarify what the issues are, and then I'll try to point us in the direction of some answers. Okay, so I'll try to explain my view and respond to some objections. Okay, so here's how names work in a very easy case. We've got some guy named Jack here in green. What's happening on the left is we've got something like a baptism ceremony. It doesn't have to be a literal baptism with water. I just am referring to an occasion on which a name is introduced and some object is dubbed with a name. So like when you name your pet, you sort of like, I hereby dub thee, our cat's name is Sherlock or something like that. Or when you have a baby, you might have a literal baptism, but even before that, you probably like introduce the name of the baby. You say, I hereby dub you Jack or whatever. Okay, so in an easy case, that's how this works. Somebody is dubbed with a name, somebody's baptized with a name. And then as time goes by, other people use the name. That's what's happening on the right. So other people inherit the name, use the name. And in an ordinary case, they're going to refer to whomever or whatever was baptized with that name, whatever was dubbed with that name. And I guess it's important to point out that it doesn't totally matter what ideas the person who's using the name has about the person. The person on the right there who's using the name Jack might have a lot of mistaken information about Jack, might have a really bad misconception of who Jack is. They might have heard a lot of rumors and lies about Jack. But it still may well be the case that when they use the name Jack, they're referring to that guy. Okay, so just quick example. A lot of people use the name Donald Trump. I think we're all referring to that one guy, but obviously some people's conceptions are mistaken. If you're on the left, you think people on the right are mistaken about what Donald Trump's like, and vice versa. If you're on the right, you think people whose name on the left are mistaken about what Donald Trump is like. But the point is just we're all referring to the same guy despite our mistaken conceptions of the guy. Okay, something else that happens with names is once in a while we reuse names, especially when it comes to people. The same name is reused many times. So a name may be ambiguous. It could be that this green guy is dubbed Jack, but also this purple guy is dubbed Jack. We recognize that names are ambiguous in this way. Sometimes you can use the same name to refer to different objects, to different people in this case, and to express different concepts. Okay.
And did you mean to change slides, because I don't see the green purple guy? Just making sure.
Yeah, I can see it on the left-hand side. You might want to click the next slide.
I need to click something.
Go to.
I did mean to change a slide.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay. All right, gotcha.
All right.
So yeah, I did.
Oh,
I
there
did
we
a
go.
slideshow. Are you telling me
Yeah.
that when I do slideshow, like nothing happens?
Go to
you can see the
view
slides.
at the top there, and it probably, once you click on view, it should have an option to put it in slideshow mode, and then you can.
Yeah, I mean, I clicked this little button down here to go into slideshow mode. Are we saying that does that work?
I see the presentation, and now it
Yeah,
shows me the green and purple, but
yeah, I guess maybe I'll
doesn't
just
look
stay
like
out of.
presentation mode.
Okay, maybe I'll just stay out of slideshow mode. So did you see this then? I guess you probably didn't see this.
Yeah. We're on slide 2.
Okay, so when I was talking about, okay, well, yeah, this is slide 2. When I was talking about baptizing Jack or dubbing Jack, this was supposed to be displayed. And then I was talking about how we can reuse names and names can be ambiguous in a certain way. Okay, and you can see all of these slides now as long as I don't go into slideshow mode. Is that right?
Right, I can see it now, yeah.
Okay. All right, then I'll just continue not in slideshow mode. All right, so here's a third possibility. Sometimes this happens with names. Sometimes one person is dubbed with 2 different names. So that's what happens in the Superman stories. One person, I guess his alien name is like Kal-El. Is that right? He's got like this alien name, this name from whatever planet he's from. But he gets 2 names. He's dubbed with the name Clark Kent, and he's dubbed with the name Superman. And so we sort of originate 2 name-using practices. And so some people use the name Superman, some people use the name Clark Kent, but both of these names, turns out, according to the story, refer to the same guy. They refer to the same guy. Now, it can be obscure when one person's using the names, or even when 2 people are using names. It can be obscure that the names refer to the same guy. So if you imagine like Lois Lane, when she's ignorant of Superman's identity, she uses both of these names, but it is obscure to her that these names are referring to the same guy. In fact, she believes that these names don't refer to the same guy. So that can easily happen. We've got 2 different names expressing 2 different concepts, but they both refer to the same guy. When that happens, it can often be obscure to us that the names co-refer. Okay, and there's lots of examples of that. All right, so far this should all be pretty familiar, but what's less common and what complicates the same God question is the possibility that a name might shift its reference, might change what it refers to. So let me give you an example of that. The next slide gives an example of that. So what's happening here is we've got 2 babies and 2 moms. We've got a green mom and a purple mom, got a green baby and a purple baby. Let's suppose in the hospital, the green mom dubs the green baby Jack. The purple mom dubs the purple baby Bob. But then unbeknownst to them and by accident, the babies are switched in the hospital. Okay, so this example traces back to philosopher Gareth Evans. So imagine the babies are switched by a nurse unknowingly. It wasn't malicious, it just happened. Okay, and then purple baby goes home with green mom. Purple baby goes home with green mom. and green baby goes home with purple mom. So now imagine what's happening in green mom's house. She's got a new baby. She doesn't know it's a new baby, and she calls this baby Jack because she thinks this baby is Jack. Now, at first, she's going to be saying a lot of false things. She's going to be saying, I'm so glad to have Jack home. But Jack isn't at her house. Jack is at purple mom's house. So at first, she'll be saying false things about Jack, about the green baby, the one who was dubbed Jack. But here's what Gareth Evans asserts, and I think this is pretty plausible, that over time, eventually, maybe after many months or years, purple baby will become known as Jack. The name Jack will refer to purple baby. So fast forward like 20 years, when green mom is at the wedding of this baby, green mom might say, I'm so happy that Jack's getting married. She's talking about the kid that grew up with her in the house. She's talking about purple baby, right? So what's happening here is a name which referred to green baby eventually starts referring to purple baby. If unbeknownst to the mom, she starts sort of accumulating enough information about purple baby and associating it with the name. So she doesn't know that there's been a baby switch. She thinks she's still referring to Jack. But what happens over time is the information that's associated with Jack was once about green baby, but over time, a lot of information about purple baby gets accumulated in there. And what Gareth Evans says is when that happens, what he calls the dossier, or the sort of file folder where we put information about the referent, it's like a mental file folder. It's not a literal file folder. It's like a mental file folder where we're all sort of accumulating information about the referent of the name. He says eventually that dossier is going to come to be filled with information about the purple baby. And when that happens, when the purple baby becomes the dominant source of information in the name's dossier, then the name shifts referent. It shifts reference. It's now going to refer to purple baby. Okay, so that's an example of reference shift. I have another example on the next slide, but let me just tell you about another example that is a little bit different from this one, but it's also from Gareth Evans, and this is a real life example. So allegedly, this is apparently how the history goes. Once upon a time, people who lived on the east coast of Africa used the word where we get our name Madagascar, but it was probably closer to the word for Mogadishu. They used a word like that to name a part of the African mainland. So it probably sounded like Mogadishu. And we still have the name Mogadishu. And that's what it referred to. It referred to Mogadishu. But then through an error of understanding on Marco Polo's part, or on the part of his scribes, the name became corrupted. It eventually kind of was corrupted into Madagascar and started referring to the island. So the name shifted its reference from a part of the African mainland to the island off the coast of Africa, off the east coast of Africa. And so it's like this baby Jack case in that what was happening was there was a name, some ancestor of Madagascar, and the dossier for that name was being filled with information about the African mainland. And so the name referred to that part of the African mainland. And then Marco Polo comes along. He wants to join the name using practice, but he mistakenly thinks the name refers to that island off the coast of Africa. And so he starts filling the dossier with information about the island. Again, by accident. This isn't like malicious. It just happens. And when enough information about the island gets into this dossier, according to Gareth Evans, the name shifts reference. So again, at first, Marco Polo was saying false things about the African mainland when he looked at the island and was like, there's Mogadishu or Madagascar or whatever the name was. He said something false. That is not Mogadishu. But then eventually, if he says enough false things about the island, eventually the name shifts reference, and he would eventually start saying true things about the island.
Right. Can I ask a question at this point? Yeah.
Yes.
So the filling, it regards the filling of the dossier. So, the way you present it, it's like a historical example, and the process happens gradually. So I guess my question is, using your example, is there like a tipping point, like does a certain amount of information have to be added to the dossier before the reference shift takes place, or is it one of those places where you can't really tell at what point it takes place?
Yeah, that's a good question, because something I've seen online is this kind of rejoinder to a person who says, you can kind of see where this is going. Eventually, I'm going to start talking about the divine names, and I'm going to the divine names have shifted reference in the mouth of people who say enough false things about God. Do they eventually shift the reference of the divine names? So a rejoinder I've seen online is, you Catholic Christian, you think that the Mormons have shifted the reference of divine names. They use names like Elohim and Heavenly Father. But at least on my view, and you two can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure, here's my understanding. If you're baptized in the Mormon church and then you become a Catholic, you have to be rebaptized.
Yes,
And
that's correct. The Vatican has
correct.
explicitly said that Mormon baptism is not Christian baptism. It is invalid. Yeah. And it's funny you mention Mormons. Actually, it's funny you mention it, because every single person I know who is involved in this conversation about Muslims and Christians will deny that Mormons worship the same God as us. So I've yet to see any Catholic argue that Mormons and Catholics worship the same God.
Yeah. So I thought the justification
something to do with the issue of polytheism. Since Mormons are affirming polytheism, Muslims clearly aren't. Could that have something to do with it?
I thought the explanation was when the Trinity is invoked at a Mormon baptism, we say something like, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I thought the justification was that's invalid because they're not really talking about the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. They're talking about something else. They're using the words, but they're not actually referring to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Whereas, like, I was baptized Lutheran, and when I became Catholic, I didn't need to get rebaptized, because I guess the Catholic view is, although the Lutherans are very mistaken about what God is like, nevertheless, when they talk about the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, they are referring to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so the baptism was valid. That's speculation on my part. I was wondering if you guys had more information.
So Lutheran is, when they say Father, Son, and Spirit, they're still referring to one divine essence, but a Mormon is referring to three divine essences. I wonder if that factored.
Yeah, right. So I thought the Catholic view was Mormons have shifted the reference of the divine names, and they're talking about things that don't, well, at least with Elohim and Heavenly Father, I don't think that refers to anything. It may well be that when they talk about Jesus, they are still talking about the historical Jesus and just saying a lot of false things about Jesus. I'm not sure what to say about the Holy Spirit. Probably they're not really talking about the Holy Spirit. But at least the Father, I would think, on the Mormon view, has shifted to fiction. That's my view. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's what's happened. And so what people online say is, hey, you believe in reference shift when it comes to Mormons using the divine names, at least Elohim and Heavenly Father, but you don't think Muslims have shifted the reference of the name, the divine names. So where do you draw the line? That's often how you hear this objection. Where do you draw the line? And so I thought I heard Louis saying something similar, like, is there going to be a tipping point in the reference shift? So I'll just tell you that what Gareth Evans says, a name shifts reference when something else becomes the dominant source of information in the name's dossier. But it's going to be vague when that happens. It's going to be unclear when it happens. So what that means is it's going to happen at some point, but it may well be very difficult for us to know exactly when it happened. It may be impossible for us to know exactly when it happened, but it happens. Like, obviously there are cases of reference shift. It may be hard to know exactly when it happens, but it happens. So I'll just point out that this kind of vagueness is ubiquitous in reality. Like, once you learn about the problem of vagueness in philosophy, you realize it's everywhere. Like, literally all of our concepts outside of mathematics and logic admit of borderline cases. So just think about like a spectrum between red and orange. Red is different from orange for sure. And as you march along the spectrum, eventually you change from red to not red, but it's really hard to know when that change happens. And if you just look around the room you're in right now, you'll realize virtually all concepts apply to these objects around the room are going to admit of borderline cases in that way. There's going to be borderline cases of chairs, borderline cases of plants, borderline cases of pillows, life, etc. Okay, so although that's a challenging question, I don't think it's a challenge for this view in particular. Vagueness is a problem for everybody, and so it's not really a problem for this view in particular. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. It's going to take a second. Hold on. Okay, so we were talking about Baby Jack, and then I told you about Madagascar and how that's another example of reference shift. Here's another example of reference shift. I think that the name Santa Claus has shifted reference, at least as contemporary Americans use the name. So I think that, like in Germany, if they ever use the name Santa Claus, or the Netherlands, it seems like they might still be talking about Saint Nicholas. So the name Santa Claus traces back to, I think in the Dutch it was like Sinterklaas. It's like a corruption of Sinterklaas, I think. You can kind of hear like Saint Niklaus, Saint Nicholas in there. So that name Santa Claus traces back ultimately to a baptism of Saint Nicholas, Agios Nikolaos. So once upon a time, a bishop, when he was very young, was baptized with that name Nicholas. And then that name got transmitted to us, but somewhere along the line, there was a fork in the road. And sometime in the 1800s, I think, Americans started telling stories, myths, and they didn't seem, the people who were telling these myths, like the night before Christmas and so on, when Santa Claus started becoming mythical, it seems like the people telling the stories weren't particularly concerned with who the stories were about. Or perhaps they were confused and thought that Santa Claus doesn't really exist anyway, let's just make up some stories about him. They wanted to join the name-using practice, but they started telling stories about nobody in particular. Okay, and then eventually the name Santa Claus shifted reference from St. Nicholas to a creature of fiction. So this guy right here, it's Coke time. And that's to say that like Santa Claus doesn't really exist. To say that it refers to a creature of fiction is to say that the name doesn't really refer at all. Okay, and then Luis, just to respond to your question, like it was probably vague when this happened. There would have been a time where it was unclear whether the name had shift reference or not. But I think we're clearly on the other side of this process. Now we know for sure the name shift reference. Right. It's hard to know exactly when it happened, but it must have happened somewhere back there.
Using the Santa Claus example, let's say hypothetically, Catholics in the United States decide to take back the Santa Claus label by filling the dossier for Santa Claus with information about the historical Saint Nicholas. Would that cause the reference shift to go back to referring to the real person?
Yeah, I think it could definitely go back. Yeah, the same thing could happen in all these cases. Madagascar, Baby Jack, etc. We could shift the name back if we started filling the dossier. If we like fought back against the reference shift and we were like, no, Santa Claus has a feast day. It's December 6th. Here's what Santa Claus really did. Yeah, to be honest, that's I'm trying to do my own small part in that. I'm trying to use the name Santa Claus to refer to Saint Nicholas. So I'm trying to make my own little small contribution to shifting the name back. But again, so here's an important point, and this is going to come up later. If I'm right that in Germany, they're still referring to St. Nicholas when they talk about Santa Claus, and in the Netherlands, they're still talking about St. Nicholas, then something interesting about reference shift is you can have two name-using communities that exist at the same time, and they're using the same name, and the name in both of their mouths traces back to the same guy, but in one of these communities, the name has shifted reference, and in the other community, it has not. Okay, so that's going to be relevant in a little while, so I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so that's one way that a name can shift reference. It could be that people just start kind of like inventing stories or telling tales or myths about nobody in particular. They're not really concerned with who this is about, and then the name shifts reference to fiction. But here's something else that could happen. So this is a hypothetical case, but maybe you've heard of this book by John Allegro, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. So
Yeah.
it's a pretty wild.
Mhm.
So I'm not at all like recommending the information in this book. I think it's badly mistaken. But his theory is basically, you can see it on the cover here. He thinks that the Christ figure evolved from a primitive fertility cult. So the view is that originally Christianity was a kind of like pagan fertility cult that was ingesting psychedelic mushrooms. And to keep this on the down low, they introduced like a code name for the mushroom, and it was like Christ or Jesus Christ or something like that. And so according to John Allegro, this is what happened. There was a baptism back in the day of a name like Jesus Christ in the Greek of a psychedelic mushroom. Okay, and then he has rediscovered that that is actually what Jesus Christ traces back to. It actually names the mushroom. So I don't think any of this is true. I'm just saying, like, according to John Allegro, this is how things happened. And then according to John Allegro, what happened is some people got confused about what Jesus Christ referred to and started thinking that it referred to an actual man. And that's what contemporary Christians, they're in that position. They think that the name Jesus Christ referred to an actual man, the Son of God. And so on John Allegro's view, what happens is the name has evolved in this sort of way. And what I would say is, if I found out that this was true, I don't for a minute think that this is true, but hypothetically, if it were true, what I would say is the name Jesus Christ as used by Christians refers to nothing at all. This would be another way of telling me that there never was a Jesus Christ. There just was this mushroom that people call Jesus Christ. So I would be in the same position as the kid who's told the facts about St. Nicholas and the facts about how there's no person living at the North Pole delivering presents. I'm in the position of the kid who concludes on the basis of that information that there is no Santa Claus. So I think something similar would happen here. And what's interesting is, and this is going to be relevant for the divine names, what happened here, and I put it in the box, is the dossier for the name Jesus Christ came to be filled with information that is just flat out incompatible with being a mushroom. So if you were to tell me, hey, guess what? There was no incarnate Son of God who lived in the 1st century and was crucified, died, buried, etc. There was nothing like that. But there was a mushroom that a pagan cult called Jesus Christ. What I would conclude is there is no way that Jesus Christ, as I'm using that name, could refer to that mushroom. It just couldn't happen. That's not how I'm using the name. So it turns out there is no Jesus Christ. So I would conclude in this hypothetical scenario, there was no Jesus. Okay, just want to repeat. I don't
on that note,
this is true. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's funny because just in the act of positing this theory, I think Allegro himself may have started filling his personal dossier for Jesus Christ with an image of a mushroom. So maybe, in a way, a reference shift did in fact occur for him, but in his case, it's him deviating away from the historical Jesus towards his mushroom Jesus.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, this slide depicts kind of how things are from John Allegro's distorted perspective, but I could have made a slide for how things really are. And it could be that John Allegro mistakenly, he wants to join the name using practice of Jesus Christ, but he mistakenly thinks that it refers to a mushroom. And so he and anyone who follows him in that linguistic community may have shifted the reference of the name. And it may be that in his mouth, when he talks about the Christ or Jesus Christ, he is talking about a mushroom. And so that's a good point to actually pause and say, this is the danger of blasphemy. My understanding is blasphemy, strictly speaking, is just saying false things about God, just saying false things about God. And the danger is, if you do that enough, you can shift the reference of the divine names so that you lose linguistic contact with God, so that you're not even talking about God anymore. You're not even thinking about God anymore. Yeah. So I think, for example, that's what happened with the Mormons. I think that the episode in Exodus where we hear about the golden calf, if the Israelites consistently applied the divine names to the golden calf, at first they would be saying false things about God, but eventually when the name shifts reference, they would be actually talking about the golden calf. So they would have lost linguistic contact with God. They would lose the ability to think or speak about God, which is really kind of scary when you think about it. So that's why I think a lot of cultures have taken blasphemy so seriously, because there's a risk that like you'll actually just start talking about something else, probably a fiction. Okay, so just quick summary, and then we'll talk about divine names. But you want to say something first? Go ahead.
Yeah, on that note, actually, I have done some research on the whole golden calf episode and what was going on there. I believe the Israelites probably intended the golden calf to act as an abstract representation of Yahweh. I don't think they literally thought that Yahweh was a golden calf. So I don't know if that piece of information changes the whether a reference
it might have been like
that particular.
Yeah, I guess it might have been like an icon or something like that. Yeah, I wonder. I don't know. I guess it's a historical question. I'd be interested to see what sort of evidence we have either way. Because obviously there's a lot of cautioning in the Old Testament against making idols and graven images. And I would have thought the concern is you will start worshiping that image, that idol, right? Instead of what's behind it. And I guess that's what motivated the iconoclasts. They thought like the concern is you're going to start venerating or worshiping the image instead of the reality that it represents. So I just wonder, I don't know what the Israelites were doing, but if it went like this, if this is how things happened, the Israelites really were referring to the golden calf and saying things like, there goes Yahweh. At first, they were saying false things because it's false that there goes Yahweh. But if they, like Marco Polo, consistently misused a name, eventually the name would shift reference. And again, then in their mouths, when they use the name Yahweh, they're not talking about God anymore. They're talking about the golden calf. Okay, so you can probably see how this is going to be relevant to divine names. And I've had this summary displayed for a while, so I'm not going to read through it or repeat it. It just kind of summarizes what I've said so far. But I feel like we should talk about how this applies to the divine names. So yeah, let's think about divine names. And here's a cool Byzantine icon I found of Moses being appeared to by the burning bush, confronting the burning bush. And apparently in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there's like Jesus in there and the Theotokos in there, which is kind of cool to think about. But just to return to this kind of banal example of one name reused of different reference, possibly that's how things went historically. And I have heard some people online talking about whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God, and it seems like they think this is what happened. So the actual Trinity was dubbed with God back in the day in partial ignorance in the Old Testament by people not knowing all the details about the Trinity, nevertheless referring to the Trinity with divine names. So there's that one historical tradition that has carried over till today, and Christians are using a descendant of those divine names that traces back to the original dubbing of the Trinity. And then there was this other using practice with a totally different historical origin. And frankly, some people who adopt this view think that what was dubbed Allah by early Muslims was really just a demon or something like that. So actually, Allah refers to a demon. And so as that name-using practice evolved, it has continued to refer to that. And when contemporary Muslims use the name Allah, that's what they're referring to. So personally, I think that is a mistake. I think that if you take Muslims at their word, it sounds like they're really trying to refer to the same God that Jews and Christians are referring to. So I admit that Muhammad probably came up with these stories in a pagan context, and he himself was a pagan, and he badly misunderstood what Christianity and Judaism were. But it sounds like at a certain point in his career, he really made it clear that the entity I'm talking about is the same one that appeared to Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, etc. It's the same. It's the same. So I think just historically, option number one is not super plausible. If anything, it was more like this case where you've got one object dubbed with two names, and perhaps it's obscure to us that the name co-refers. Okay, but you wanted to say something, Luis?
Yeah. I don't know how deeply you delved into many of the Quran's arguments against Christians vis-a-vis the Trinity, but the impression I get from a lot of them is the Quranic author, even in the midst of arguing against Christians, does seem to assume that his Christian interlocutors are worshiping the same God as him.
Yeah, I guess so. I wouldn't say I've delved super deeply, but I do know that there are these arguments against the Trinity in the Quran, and I know that they're typically pretty bad arguments that badly misunderstand what the doctrine is. But I guess you're right now that you pointed out that it seems like what the Quran is saying is Allah is not like this. You all say that Allah is like this, but Allah is really not like that. So it sounds like the Quran is trying to have like a first order disagreement with Christians in the neighborhood. And that would require that the divine names have the same referent, right? If they're saying, if the author of the Quran is saying, you Christians claim that Allah is like this, but he's not. He's totally a unity. There's just one, there's no son, etc. Yeah, so it looks like at least the author of the Quran, if you take the author's word for it, is using the divine names to refer to whatever it is the Christians are referring to with God, and just like correcting the Christian misunderstanding from the Quran's perspective. Christians are misunderstanding what God is like. Yeah, so there's some more evidence that really... Go ahead.
Yeah, but you could counter argue that though by saying that the Book of Mormon and its author also tries to refer to the Christian God, but we don't accept their claim to refer to the Christian God on those grounds. I don't think acknowledging that the Quranic author is making that attempt is sufficient grounds to say that they have succeeded.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, I guess I would say this. The fact that the author of the Quran seems to be trying to refer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is some evidence that that's what the author is referring to. But I agree that sometimes that can fail. If, for example, the author badly misunderstands who Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are, that could happen. And something else, I was a little careful in how I said this. I said it sounds like the Quran is trying to have like a first order disagreement over what God is like. But if a name shifts reference, then you can have episodes that appear to be like a first order disagreement, but really it's a second order disagreement over what words refer to. So I'll give you an example with Santa Claus. That name has shifted reference. When my daughter was young, we told her the truth about St. Nicholas, and we said, look, the name Santa Claus really just refers to St. Nicholas as it's traditionally used. Let's join that name using practice. St. Nicholas was a great man. He did a lot of really good things. He's dead now. He's in heaven. This is what we told her. My brother elected to go a different route with his kids, and he told his kids the Santa Claus myth. And then one Christmas when they were very young, my daughter said to her cousins, they were talking about gifts, and her cousins were so excited that Santa Claus was going to come and deliver gifts. And my daughter was genuinely confused. And what do you mean Santa Claus is dead? Santa Claus is dead, she said. And then the cousins got really upset, and it appeared like a disagreement. And it seemed like they were having a disagreement over whether Santa Claus is dead. But really, they were just disagreeing over what the name refers to, right? They thought, you should use the name Santa Claus to refer to this guy at the North Pole who delivers presents, and that guy's definitely not dead. Whereas my daughter was part of a different name-using practice, and she thought the name Santa Claus referred to St. Nicholas, who is dead and is in heaven. And so it looked like a disagreement. There were tears. There was a lot of anger and frustration. Parents had to intervene, but it wasn't a disagreement over the same object, right? So it sounded like a disagreement over the same object, but they had different reference. Okay, so something similar could happen even on the pages of the Quran when it says, you Christians think Allah is triune, but he's not. There's really just one God. It sounds like a disagreement over what God is like, but if the names have shifted reference, this is a merely apparent disagreement. Yeah, and I guess just as an aside here, as I'm thinking out loud, as we stream this live, I always thought like one really strong bit of evidence against the divine authenticity of the Quran is that the arguments against the Trinity are really bad, and I would have expected more from God. But also, if the name has shifted reference, I would expect God to have known that and to have mentioned that. If the names had shifted reference and Christians aren't even talking about God anymore, I would have expected God to have pointed that out on the pages of the Quran. All right, but if it's okay with you, I'll proceed a little bit and think about whether reference might have shifted and then respond to some objections. So yeah, I thought that probably a more historically accurate depiction of what happened with the divine names between Christians and Muslims was they intend to join a name-using practice that traces back to the original baptism of the Trinity. And then actually I put a what I think is a more accurate representation. It's probably actually more like this. So there was just one dubbing of God back in Hebrew with like Yahweh or something like that. And then that name using practice has evolved, and here I am joining that name using practice, and it traces back to that original dubbing of God with divine names. Muslims have branched off. And so if this is what happens, they still refer to God. They just are part of this branch. So it's a little more like the Superman case where Allah is referring to God and the English divine names are referring to God, but it's unclear to us whether this is happening. So we're kind of in a position of Lois Lane in the Superman stories where we've got these two names. We're not sure whether they co-refer, but if this picture is right about how things happened, they really do co-refer. Okay, I think that probably is what happened. So remember, my answer to the question is, yeah, probably yes. But what complicates the issue and makes it so difficult is the possibility that reference has shifted, at least for some Muslims and perhaps some Christians. Okay, so could that have happened? Here's what would have to be the case in order for the divine names to have shifted reference. It would have to look perhaps something like the Santa Claus case. So remember, in the Santa Claus case, we have a bishop living a long time ago who was dubbed with the name Nicholas, and then we get this naming practice that persists in places like Germany and the Netherlands, but which branched off, and then we got this break in the chain in the contemporary United States where we started telling myths and tales about nobody in particular, and then the name shifted reference. And now when most people use the name Santa Claus in the United States, they're referring to a fiction. They're referring to nothing at all. Okay, so if Muslims did something like that, the picture would look very similar. We have a dubbing of the Trinity in the Old Testament. They didn't know that they were dubbing a Trinity, but they did. That name-using practice continues, and when Christians join that name-using practice using the divine names, they're referring to that same entity that the Jews were referring to. But here's a possibility that we would have to rule out in order to answer the question whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God. Could it be that when Muhammad and possibly others were authoring the Quran, they were engaged in something like what the myth makers and tale spinners were engaged in with respect to Santa Claus? They were telling stories without really any regard as to who the stories were about. Yeah, they just they weren't really concerned with who the stories were about. And so they filled the dossier with information about a fiction. That's one possibility. And that would be like the Santa Claus case. Another possibility is, remember the sacred mushroom and the cross example, where it looks like another way to shift the reference of a name is to fill the dossier with crucial information that is like incompatible with the reality of the situation. So if Christians are using the name Jesus Christ and a crucial bit of information in that dossier is that he was a person, then if you were to find out that really there was only a mushroom, you would conclude, I guess there was no Jesus. So another possibility is that Muslims or the authors of the Quran in founding Islam said some things about Allah that are crucial and incompatible with the reality of the situation. So that's another possibility. And so I think people who give a negative answer to this question when they say Christians and Muslims don't worship the same God. I think they assume something like that happened. And that's why they'll tell you, like, here's how Allah understood Islam. He might be all powerful, but he's not really all good. He doesn't really love everybody. He's considered like kind of a trickster God or deceptive. And so they'll tell you, like, they'll sort of list all the differences between the Christian conception of God and the Islamic conception of Allah. And I think what they're trying to convince you of is that reference shift must have happened because the dossier got filled with information that's incompatible with what God is really like. And that information was absolutely crucial. So that, I think that's what the issue turns on. I think we can all agree, or okay, I don't know if we can all agree, but I think that's what happened with Mormons. I think they filled the dossier of the divine names with information that is pretty clearly incompatible with the reality of the situation. When they tell you, oh yeah, God, that's what I mean by Heavenly Father, or Elohim, when I use those names. I mean the same thing you mean. But Heavenly Father used to be a man. He was elevated to godhood. In fact, there's infinitely many such beings. And this one lives on a planet and has a wife and has been producing spirit babies. So when you hear the whole story, I think you realize that if that were true, that would not be God, right? That would not be God. And even if there were a being like that was referred to as Heavenly Father, there's just no way that that name would stick to the real God. If Mormonism turned out to be false and Christianity turned out to be true, I think the right thing to conclude on the part of the Mormon is, oh, there is no Heavenly Father. There is no Kolob. There are no spirit babies. There's just this other thing, this non-physical, eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being that the Christians call God. So I think that plausibly happened in the case of the Mormons. The question is, did it happen in the case of the Muslims? Did they corrupt the dossier of the divine names so badly that there's that reference shift occurred? I guess that's the issue. And yeah, I think it's not entirely clear. I think probably no, but I admit it's possible. So I guess that's where I'm at on this question. So yeah, just in summary, I think plausibly, the name Allah traces back to God and refers to God, albeit in an obscure way, in the same way that Superman traces back to Clark Kent, but obscurely. Not everybody can see that. And even if that's true, I just want to reiterate for people in the audience who disagree, and I just want to caution you against hearing me as saying anything other than this. I think Muslims are very, very mistaken about what God is like, and I think it's dangerous how mistaken they are. Just as Lois Lane was very mistaken about what Clark Kent is like. But I admit there is some chance that Allah has shifted reference, at least for some Muslims and for some Christians. Okay, and then I'll just pause there and say I've got some objections and responses lined up, but let's see if we want to have a little conversation first.
Yeah, Lewis, I know you probably have some questions, and also everybody in the chat, go ahead and send your questions. Make sure to tag me at Reason and Theology.
Yeah, I've been trying to formulate a coherent theory about how I think Muslims could refer to the one true God. And this is what I have so far. So I think it's tied to the concept of natural revelation, what Christians would call natural revelation. So the idea that you can know about God through reason, through your conscience, through observing a created world. And you'll notice that the Quran has true facts about God, but then those happen to be the same facts that you can discern through observing the universe, intuition, and conscience, etc. So my theory is that Muslims are able to refer to the true God because their holy scriptures and their religion preserves just enough of those truths that are derived from natural revelation that Muslims can use that to refer to God. What are your thoughts on that model?
So you said maybe when they use the word Allah are referring to God, but it's just because the Quran has some information that was derived from like natural theology, like pure reason, not from divine revelation. But just by
so that's
thinking
what
about
I'm
things.
thinking.
Yeah. So Paul says some interesting things in Romans 1. suggesting that like everybody can know about God just by observing nature, so that men are without excuse. So like there's really no excuse to not know about God. That seems to be what Paul's suggesting. So just by like a basic kind of design argument or teleological argument, you can glom on to God, you can refer to God, you can introduce names for God if you just have a very minimal conception of God as the creator of all of this. So if you just imagine like a primitive kind of people living in isolation, they haven't been encountered by Christians or Jews or Muslims, but they observe the world around them and they're pretty convinced that there was a creator of all of this. I think it's pretty plausible that they're referring to God, right? If they say like, let's set up a little altar to worship the creator of all things. Well, there's only one creator of all things, and he is knowable through nature, through observing the created order. So yeah, I'm thinking those people are probably referring to God. So your thought is the Quran does something like that, and in virtue of that, they might be referring to God. Yeah, I guess the only concern I have is you could, if you just had that kind of minimal conception, like the creator of all, then it's plausible you're referring to God. But if you start importing other things in there, then you may shift reference. I was just going to mention that I am aware that some of the conciliar documents coming out of Vatican II seem to say things that entail that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. But something that's interesting, and I think that might be relevant, is when they assert that, they use a pretty minimal conception of God. They say something like, in Nostra Aetate, in paragraph 3, they say, the church regards with esteem also the Muslims. They adore the one God. And then they give like a description of God. Living and subsisting in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to men. Okay, so what they really intentionally do there is give us a description of God that is shared by both Christians and Muslims, right? And so if that were the reference fixing description that Muslims use, if when they use the divine names, they have in mind something like this: no matter what else Allah is like, he's at least this, living and subsisting in himself, merciful, all-powerful, creator of heaven and earth. Then I think it's plausible they do refer to God. But the concern is sometimes the dossier that the information they associate with a name can become corrupted with other information. And if that other information is considered like crucial for the name to refer, then it starts looking like the name has shifted reference. So again, that might have happened with the sacred cross and the mushroom case, sacred mushroom and the cross case. So I would have thought that when we use the name Jesus, we have a little reference fixing description, and we say like, here's what I mean to refer to. Whatever else Jesus is like, he was at least a person, right? I guess I admit that like if the atheist is right and he was a mere man, not God at all, didn't really do any miracles, I would still think that I'm referring to that guy. So I don't think for a second that's true. This is purely hypothetical. But if I found out that that was the reality of the situation, I would still think Jesus was referring. But when John Allegro tells me it was just a mushroom, Jesus Christ was just a mushroom, then I think the thing to say is, what you're telling me is there was no Jesus. It was just this other thing that people called Jesus. And that's because there's a certain crucial bit of information in my reference fixing description, namely that whatever else he is, Jesus is a person. Okay, so my only concern is that not all Muslims, when they use the name Allah, might have this kind of minimal reference fixing description that is compatible with the truth of Christianity. They may well, when they use the divine names, think something like this: whatever else Allah is, he is like kind of deceptive. He doesn't really love everybody. He revealed himself to Muhammad. So if they think that information is crucial, then I think what they would say is, man, if Christianity is true, there is no Allah. It would be like me and John Allegro. When I say, if you're right, John Allegro, there is no Jesus. There's just this mushroom. So for any Muslims who use the name Allah in this kind of beefed up, thick way, where some false information is elevated to a crucial status, an essential status in the reference fixing description, then I think this thing to say is they're not really referring to the same object we're referring to. Yeah, so even if they started with natural theology and that was part of the reference fixing description, the danger is if they put too much false information in the dossier, they'll shift reference. Yeah, I'll just give one more example. It would be just like in the golden calf scenario, if I arrived at a knowledge of God through natural theology and I thought there must be a creator of all, that's all well and good. I'm probably talking about God. But if then I go further and say, and he's that golden calf, now it's unclear whether I've shifted the reference. And if I consistently refer to the golden calf using divine names, it becomes much more plausible that I shifted the reference to the calf. Yeah, so that's my concern.
There was something there that stood out to me. You referred to deception and that maybe shifts the reference. What do you make of, I can think of at least half a dozen biblical passages that explicitly say that the God of the Bible deceives people. Like, you explicitly says that. So do you think that would still, even if Allah of the Quran deceives people, do you think that would still map onto the God of the Bible, since they're similar things?
Yeah, I guess what I was assuming was the God that Christians worship is not deceptive, at least not to the degree that Muslims say. So I guess I could be wrong about that. I guess I'd want to see the verses you have in mind.
Yeah, fair enough.
Read the context and see what the best interpretation of those passages is. But I guess at most this would just not be a good example anymore of some information that a Muslim might put in the dossier that would be incompatible with the reality of the situation. Then that Allah is deceptive, but God is not deceptive wouldn't be a good example anymore, wouldn't be true anymore. So then it would just be things like, here's some other information they could put in the dossier such that if they elevated it to a crucial status, an essential status, would possibly shift the reference, something like revealed himself to Muhammad, no second, not a Trinity. How about, I should have just done that. Not a Trinity. If that was essential, then there's just no way they're referring to the God of Christianity. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Lewis. I think he had a question.
Yeah. One of the arguments that I've seen some Eastern Orthodox critics of Catholicism make is they've tried to make a theoretical distinction between referring and worshiping. Like they might concede that Muslims refer to the true God and yet still fail to worship him. So how would that work according to your theories? Can someone refer to successfully to the true God and yet still fail to worship him?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So something that I was sort of assuming in approaching this question is, if we wanted to answer the question of whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God, the first thing we need to establish is whether Muslims are even referring to God when they use the name Allah. Because if they're directing their worship towards a fictional object, then it's pretty clear they're not worshiping God. But if, on the other hand, when they talk about Allah, they really are talking about God in a confused and mistaken way, very badly mistaken, but they're still referring to God in just the same way that Lois Lane refers to Superman when she talks about Clark Kent, unknown to her. She has a very badly mistaken conception of who Clark Kent really is. She thinks he's very weak, very just a nerd. She thinks she doesn't love him, but unbeknownst to her, she actually does love him, and he's not weak and he's not a nerd. So it would be kind of like that. So it could be that the Muslims are referring to God when they use the name Allah in a very confused and mistaken way. And then I kind of thought, back when I wrote the paper in 2017, I sort of thought that as long as you had linguistic contact with God, if you then direct worship towards that object, you are worshiping that object. And it may be that your worship is improper, unacceptable, very bad, but still you would count as worshiping that God. So yeah, I didn't mean to say that if Muslims are worshiping God, that means that their worship is acceptable or that it plays some role in their salvation. I don't think that's true. But the thought was just this: if Muslims really are referring to God when they use the name Allah, then there are some things they can do. They can think about God. They can form various intentions with regard to God. They can have certain desires about God, and they could worship God. Worship is just kind of a mental attitude that one has of paying homage, right? And the way we express that physically is we like bow down, but it's most of all a mental attitude. And they could direct that mental attitude towards God if they are in linguistic contact with God. Okay, so that's something I always thought. But I agree with you that I've also seen online many of our Orthodox brothers in Christ think that even if Muslims are referring to God when they use the divine names, nevertheless, they don't really count as worshiping God. And I have an actual example. That's one of the objections that I prepared to talk about. I'll just share my screen one more time here. A window. Yeah, so this Jay Dyer fellow, who I've just learned about recently, but yeah, he's been the source of a lot of the online Orthodox talking points about this. Here's something he says expressing this view. He said this, so if you can see my screen, you can see the video and the approximate timestamp if you want to go listen to this. He says something like this: the debate was not just about sense and reference. It was about worship. And God specifically is worshipped through sacrifice. And Islam notoriously doesn't have that. And so I think his argument is something like, you can worship God only if sacrifice is involved. Muslims aren't making any sacrifices to God when they claim that they're worshiping God. So they're not really worshiping God. So even if they successfully refer to God, what they're considering worship isn't genuine worship, because to be genuine worship, there has to actually be sacrifice. So yeah, that seems to be a view. It's like a condition on genuine worship. And the claim is if worship doesn't involve sacrifice, it's not really worship. So yeah, that's something I hadn't heard before. So here's just, I'm not like a scholar of the historical biblical documents. I just did like a real quick, very quick word study of like the words in the there's a couple words that are sometimes translated into English as worship in the Old Testament. This is one of them. Not totally sure how to pronounce it, so sorry if I mispronounce it, but I guess it looks like it's pronounced shaka. It looks like it's translated as worship 99 times in the biblical text, at least in the King James Version, according to Strong's Concordance. But sometimes it's translated as bow, sometimes bow down, sometimes fall down, sometimes crouch. So it looks like it has a kind of literal meaning of just literally bowing. But sometimes in the context, it's clear that what's going on here is worship, as the English word is used, and so sometimes translated as worship. Yeah. So you see some like some paradigmatic texts about worship, like Exodus 25, where we're told not to worship other gods, but it's this word that's used. And it looks like the literal sense of the word is just bow down. You shall not bow down to other gods. Another word that I didn't put on the slides here that's sometimes translated as worship is just the word that's sometimes translated as serve. So my impression is it looks like there's two words in Hebrew that we're translating as the English word worship, and it's either bow down or serve. And here's some other examples of that word showing up in just classic texts. And I guess I would also point out in the Psalms, we're told to sing to God and worship. No sacrifice involved, but there's worship going on. So it looks like worship does not require sacrifice into the Psalms. Same thing happens in the New Testament. I was just going to tell you. You can shed some light on this?
If I may, I could. Yeah, because Hebrew and Greek linguistics is one of my stronger suits. So in both Hebrew and Greek, there's actually multiple words that get translated into worship, and they don't all mean exactly the same thing. But because we tend to translate them with the same English word, the differences in their semantic domains tend to get blurred. So for example, in Hebrew, shaka is one of the words for to worship. There's another word, avad, that gets used. In fact, when the Deuteronomy says you shall worship and serve God, it pairs those two together. And avad, it has more of a connotation of liturgical worship, and that kind of worship connotes sacrifice. So when Jay Dyer makes the argument that worship involves sacrifice, his argument would be valid if what he had in mind was one particular type of worship from a Hebrew standpoint, i.e., the avad, the one denoted by the word avad.
I
Okay.
also
Well, if it's
wonder,
something sorts of,
between the temples, right? I mean, would one with that position argue that there was no worship of the one true God since there was no actual sacrifice taking place? It seems
if
like the
sacrifice
Bible
is
also
required for
speaks of a
worship, yeah.
sacrifice of praise and things like that too.
Yeah. Yeah. So something else I thought was, well, maybe we're using sacrifice in like a really loose sense so that when you sing, you're kind of making a sacrifice. But again, if that's true, then if we're using sacrifice in that very broad sense, where it doesn't require an altar or any kind of like blood sacrifice, then I guess prayer is another way to do that. And it sure looks like Muslims are praying. And I guess in regard to the first point, Luis, you had said there might be more than one word that's translated as worship. Yeah, that was my impression as well. But unless we want to say that like this other kind of worship that looks like just bowing down isn't genuine worship, unless we want to say that, then I think we have to admit that one valid way of worshiping is just bowing down and like prostrating oneself and kneeling. That's a way of expressing worship or reverence. And whatever else Muslims are doing, again, I don't mean to like suggest that their worship is successful or acceptable or proper. I don't think it is, but it looks like they're engaged in a kind of worship. I mean, if anybody's bowing down while they're praying, it's Muslims. Right?
Yeah,
So they're
and
definitely engaged in kind of worship.
Yeah.
and Lewis, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't Muslims have animal sacrifices during Eid and stuff like that?
Eid al-Adha, yes, they do sacrifice animals in a way, although whether sacrifice is the right word to refer to that is debatable because they don't believe that slaughtering all those animals during Eid is redemptive in any way. It's more of like a commemorative event to commemorate the binding of of Abraham's son. They're reenacting that event to celebrate it.
Thank you. That's helpful.
All right, yeah, that's something else I didn't know, but that's interesting. I'm sorry, I've been saying Luis. Is it Lewis? Should I be saying Lewis?
I answer to both.
Okay.
I usually go with Lewis because it's easier for most English speakers.
All right, I think I know exactly what you've been dealing with your whole life because I have Thomas and Tomas, and I'm in a similar boat. All right, can you tell me a little bit about the New Testament then? So I thought it may well be that we've got more than one Greek word being translated as worship, but if in the paradigm examples of worship in the New Testament we're using a certain Greek word, and that's the same kind of word that could be applied to Muslims, then I thought we could safely conclude whatever else is going on, they're engaged in a kind of worship.
Right.
So, like, here's a paradigm example.
The New Testament. Yeah, it's funny because in Koine Greek, there's at least 5 or 6 different words that refer to worship. The two most common ones I'll stick to because they're most relevant for our purposes are proskuneo and latrepho. And proskuneo, literally, if you look at the etymology of it, it has to do with like facing the ground, like going towards the ground to kiss it. So it has that connotation of worship through prostration. And interestingly, if you look at how it's used in the Bible, it's not always in a religious context. Like people will give proskinesis to political rulers, for example. So you could argue that Muslims are engaging in proskinesis. So yeah, you can see proskuneo there. That's the word in question. Now, the other word that is not as often used is latrepho, and if you look at all the places where it's used in the New Testament, it is always in a context that is liturgical or cultic in nature. So the worship in the Jerusalem temple is considered a form of latreia, as well as the early Christian house worship. So it's easy to make the argument that this kind of worship is what J. Dyer has in mind when he makes his argument, because Catholics actually say something very similar. We say that we give latria to God and dulia to the saints, and most Catholics will say that one of the key distinctions is that latria involves sacrifice, but dulia doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so so are you thinking, Luis, that there might be a kind of worship that does require sacrifice? Is that what you're saying, or is that not what you were saying?
I think you can make an argument that Muslims do give what the New Testament would call proskinesis towards God. It's worship that involves prostration. Whether they give latreia, which is cultic liturgical worship, is a little bit debatable, because you could argue that the 5 times ritual salat is a form of liturgy. But it's not the kind of liturgy that we would think of. It's not like the Mass or anything. It doesn't involve the Eucharist.
Lewis, wouldn't the Eastern Orthodox argue that when they bow down to an icon of Jesus, or even prostrate fully to an icon of Jesus, that they're offering worship?
Yeah, they would say that it is a form of worship. In Eastern Orthodox context, I don't know if they quite use words like proskinesis and latreia the same way that I just described in the New Testament.
All right, so then, maybe, I guess we're agreeing then that there is a kind of worship that happens a lot in the Bible that does not require sacrifice. And so if the question is, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God, there's a way in which Muslims could be worshiping even if there's no sacrifice involved.
Yeah. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and I guess my concern to this view would just be, if Muslims are referring to God and they can think about God and have desires about God and intentions about God, why couldn't they also revere God or pay homage to God? Again, like in a confused and mistaken way. I just need to keep adding that to try to forestall misunderstandings. But yeah, I guess I'll just once more use the Superman analogy. I know this is like getting tired, but it could be that Lois Lane loves Clark Kent without knowing it. Right? She loves Superman, and Superman is Clark Kent. She could revere Clark Kent without knowing it. She could pay homage to Clark Kent by paying homage to Superman. Yeah, so to say that Muslims are worshiping God is not to say that they properly understand God or that their worship is acceptable. It's just to say that they're in they have a certain kind of mental attitude to what turns out to be the triune God, and it's totally surprising to them. I guess since we're limited on time, I just wanted to address one more objection that I'm seeing out there in the ether and that I think should be addressed. And the objection is, so what makes this an interesting philosophical puzzle is, if you say that Muslims and Christians don't worship the same God, you have to tell a story of how Christians and Jews nevertheless do worship the same God. And that can be really puzzling. If you take the no response to Christians and Muslims, how are you going to avoid saying no to Christians and Jews? And that sure seems.
Yeah.
If on the other hand, you say, go ahead.
Yeah, it's funny because this is just my observation, but Protestants and Eastern Orthodox answer that question differently. Most of the Eastern Orthodox I know will bite the bullet and say Jews do not worship the true God. Protestants,
that's so rough.
for the most part, I've seen still want to retain belief that the Jews worship the true God. So they're more vulnerable to that critique.
Yeah. So as I was saying, that's like one half of the interesting philosophical puzzle. The other half is, if you say yes, Christians and Muslims do worship the same God, then you start getting questions about Mormonism and other kinds of like wacky views about God, where it's pretty clear. Oh, I've even heard people say like, oh, so then if like a Satanist decides to call Satan God, he's really talking about God. So yeah, then you people try to like urge reductios on you in the other direction. But I wanted to talk about one response that I've seen some online Orthodox folks give about the Jewish question, whether Jews and Christians worship the same God. And they'll say, well, maybe I mean, Jesus was Jewish, and it sure looks like he was talking about God when he used the divine names. But since then, any Jewish person who denies the Trinity simply could not be referring to the same God. So it's one thing to be ignorant about what God is like, the way that perhaps Moses and Abraham and so on were. They were ignorant that God is a Trinity,
Yeah.
but they didn't actively reject that God is a Trinity. And if you actively reject some essential attribute of God, then there's no way you could be referring to God. So I was going to say one quick thing in reply, but you go first.
Yeah, it's funny. Doesn't St. Paul explicitly say otherwise? In Romans 10, he says, they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge, which implies that they do, in fact, worship God.
Yeah. He does say some things that imply that Jewish people are worshiping God, and it sure looks like he was trying to correct them about what God is like. I guess I could imagine the opponent that I have in mind saying, well, what Paul meant was they're ignorant about what God is like because they don't know that he's a Trinity, but they don't actively reject it. And so that's why they still count as having a zeal for God in ignorance, because they're ignorant that he's a Trinity. But something very important changes when you're told that God's a Trinity and you reject it. Now you just can't be referring to God anymore. So that's the position. I saw this on a Redeemed Zoomer stream. He considers this kind of response. I can give you a timestamp if you want, but I'll just tell you really quickly in reply. I think it is totally possible to refer to something, again, in ignorance, and not just be failing to affirm certain essential attributes about the thing, but in fact be denying attributes about the thing that are essential. So just to use the Lois Lane example one more time, when she uses the name Clark Kent, she is actually referring to Superman, unbeknownst to her. And I'm pretty sure there's a point in at least some of the stories that are canonical. I'm not a comic book nerd, but I think there's some part of the Superman canon where Lois Lane is like presented with the suggestion that Clark Kent is Superman and actively denies it. Says like, there's no way that Clark Kent is Superman. And you can imagine her denying that Clark Kent is an alien, that from a different planet, right? She could deny all that. So if that is essential to who Clark Kent is, and it looks like it is, she would still be referring to Superman with the name Clark Kent while denying some important essential attributes about him. Okay, and then one other quick response, and then I'll stop talking, I promise. So I think that it's pretty clear that the Muslims are worshiping when they kneel and pray and bow down and give reverence and pay homage. They do need to be worshiping something. So I think an important question that our Orthodox and Protestants brothers ask themselves is, what is the Muslim worshiping, if not God in ignorance? What are they worshiping? And there's only a few answers you can give. You could say something like a demon or an idol or some kind of mental idea in their mind, a construct in their minds. Jada had something like that. He thinks Muslims are worshiping like a little mental construction in their minds, or maybe nothing at all. Maybe it's like how Santa Claus refers to nothing at all. But whatever you say Muslims are worshiping, they deny that they're worshiping that thing. So if you ask a Muslim, are you worshiping nothing at all? They'll say, no, I'm worshiping Allah. Are you worshiping a mental construct? No, I'm not. Are you worshiping an idol? Are you worshiping a demon? They say no. And yet, even on this Protestant Orthodox view, they nevertheless succeed in referring to that thing, whatever it is they're referring to. So I would think that the Protestant or Orthodox friend of ours should admit that it is possible to refer to something and indeed worship something, even when you deny certain essential attributes of that thing.
And just to be clear, the Eastern Orthodox patriarchs all explicitly say that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. So those online Orthodox apologists aren't really consistent with their own patriarchs. And by the way, you mentioned Redeemed Zoomer. I thought that was hilarious because literally during this live stream, he came to my comment section on an unrelated video and started trolling and saying, tell me more about how Muslims can be saved by following Islam, because this is actually a claim that the Pope's make in a very qualified sense. And I said, ask Pope Francis about it. Do you recall him? He's the guy you said is in heaven just a few days ago. It's interesting how people try to process this information and end up, in my opinion, becoming pretty irrational. in the discussions. But be that as it may, sorry for the rabbit trail.
Yeah.
Lewis, I think you
Yeah.
had a comment there.
Yeah, I had a thought that came to mind. I'm sure you gentlemen have heard of the stories of how certain Muslims they converted to Christianity because they saw Jesus in their dreams. I've heard a lot of those stories, and I even met one or two such people myself. And according to them, they came to a point where they were seeking God. They would pray to God while still professing to be Muslims, and then God would answer them by appearing. Jesus would answer them by appearing in their dreams, and that would lead to them coming to faith in Christ, which is really interesting because if Muslims aren't worshiping God, then why is God incarnate answering their prayers? You know what I mean? It seems that God, at least in those cases, regards their prayers as being directed to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. That's some evidence in favor of the claim that they're referring to God and praying to God. I guess, just to put on my contrarian hat, one could also say God is omniscient. He knows everything that's happening, and he realizes that this person is trying to reach out to him through no fault of his or her own, isn't really referring to him, but is trying to. And so God responds in an appropriate way. I guess here's another analogy that's a little bit worn out in this context, but the Last Battle story by C.S. Lewis, where that Emmett character is confronted by Aslan, and then Aslan says something like, "You've always been looking for me in your worship of Tash." It sure looks like when Emmett was using the name Tash, he was referring to that demon. But somehow in that story, like Aslan knows that you're the kind of person who is really looking for me, even though you were following Tash. So maybe something like that is happening. So I imagine that's what your opponent would say.
Yeah. See, the issue with that is, well, first of all, C.S. Lewis strikes me as a sort of person who would agree that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. Second, it's very interesting that this phenomenon seems to almost exclusively happen with Muslims. And on rare occasions, Jews. I never hear of Hindus, Buddhists, etc., having the same phenomenon. I don't hear of mass conversions of Hindus seeing Jesus in their dreams, which suggests to me that there is something qualitatively different about Muslim and Jewish worship that causes God to listen to them in a way that non-Abrahamic religionists aren't.
Yeah, if that's true, then I think you're right. There would be something to that claim then. If, for example, Hindus are asking Brahman or whatever to help them see the light, and they're not really getting any revelations from God, whereas it is happening with Muslims. That would matter. I guess I just wanted to briefly say, here's something else I've heard in the comments and online. People are like, well, you just ask Muslims what they think, and especially ask Muslim converts to Christianity, like whether they think that they're worshiping the same God before and after or not. And I just say this in reply, and I guess maybe I shouldn't have gone out of my way to say this because this might sound a little bit edgy or dismissive, but I think the issues here are really difficult and require a lot of careful philosophical reflection. And it may well be that somebody who doesn't fully grasp the intricate issues of reference and the different kinds of worship may be confused about how to describe his or her own life story and may misdescribe it. So just because a Muslim says well, I converted to Christianity, I can tell you it's a very different God. What they really might be trying to express is, I converted to Christianity and I can tell you God is very different from how I thought he was.
You know what I
so
would
they might
find
just be
interesting
misdescribing.
that's related to that, if you ask the average Catholic, or really just any Christian, about the Trinity, in most cases they're a heretic, right? They'll describe a Trinitarian heresy. So even most Christians, I don't think, can actually accurately describe the God that they worship. And so I think that there's that might backfire, right? If that experiment might backfire. There's a but
it seems to be,
it supports what you're saying. Yeah,
it seems to me to be a manifestation of this kind of perspectivalism we have, or standpoint epistemology. That's what it is. Like, if you want to know some question, you should ask people who are particularly well situated to answer it, people who have experienced it, people who have the right kind of lived experience. But I think your point is, apt. It's well taken. If you ask Christians what they're worshiping, you're going to get a lot of mistaken answers. And I think it could be that, like, Christians do worship the Trinity, even if they can't articulate properly what
it, right.
the Trinity is. Yeah.
I suspect also if you ask those Muslim converts who converted to Christianity to articulate what it is that they worship, they would also likely be material heretics. Just in my experience of talking to people about the Trinity and dogma, but yeah. Anyways, there, Louis, I know you have to head out here in just a second. Did you have any other questions? Because I did see a super chat I wanted to grab.
No, I think all my questions are answered. So I will head out, and I'll leave the two of you to answer the audience Q&A.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Random thanks for being here, Luis.
Yep.
We only have our insufficient language and symbols to determine what Muslims are saying, creating a semiotic paradox. Wouldn't it be more honest to properly infer their intent?
Oh, is this for me? Was that? Oh, unfortunately, the question disappeared. I was going to have to read that.
Oh, I'll bring it back up. Let me bring it back up. Hold on. Here we go. Yeah. There we go.
Okay. We only have our insufficient language and symbols to determine what Muslims are saying. I guess I'd want to know, what is the semiotic paradox that is being created? Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I can ignore that for a sentence. Yeah. Maybe the question is actually, wouldn't it be more honest to properly infer their intent? Well, that's part of what I'm trying to do. I am trying to properly infer their intent, right? I'm trying to do that. Mm-hmm. So if it is more honest to do that, I guess that's good. I checked that box. I'm doing the honest thing. But yeah, that is what I'm trying to do. I am trying to properly infer specifically, like, the object of their intentions. Mm-hmm. I understand that they'll tell you, like, I intend to worship Allah. Yeah, okay, but the question is, when they said Allah, what did they refer to? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just like when Lois Lane is going on a date with Superman, if you asked her, are you going on a date with Clark Kent? She'd say no. But unfortunately, she's just mistaken about, like, who Clark Kent is. She really is going on a date with Clark Kent. She just doesn't know it. So similarly, even if a Muslim were to say, I do not intend to worship your Trinity, I just intend to worship Allah, well, they may be mistaken. I understand what they intend to do, but sometimes reality is obscure to us, and we don't understand how our intentions map onto reality.
There's another question here from Ramses. Sorry if this has already been addressed, but I remember hearing an accusation that Allah was a moon god that Muhammad elevated. Is there any credence to this, and where does this come from?
Yeah, this is a good question for those like Christian apologists who specialize in Islam. I am not an expert in the history of Islam, but I guess I have heard that, at least in the context where Muhammad started preaching, he was surrounded by, himself was a pagan. It may well be that originally he thought that his revelations were coming from a pagan god, maybe. And I think as a Christian, what you have to say is it wasn't God who was giving him these revelations. So it was either a purely psychological phenomenon or some sort of malevolent supernatural entity, a demon. So I think that's what a Christian should say. But it could be that even if a demon was giving these revelations, the demon might be using divine names in such a way to refer to God. I mean, after all, that's what the serpent did in the garden when the serpent talked to Eve and was like, did God really say, you'll surely die, or something like that? Even Satan can refer to God with the divine names. So it may well be that whoever it was that was revealing these things to Muhammad was referring to God. And wouldn't that be like kind of what you'd expect a demon to do, to say a lot of false things about God? That seems like a much more insidious thing to do, rather than just like invent a fiction and tell Muhammad a bunch of fictional just a story about a fiction, it'd be much more insidious to say a lot of false things about God. So that's one thing that might have been happening. Another thing that might have been happening is it may well have been that originally when Muhammad was using these divine names, he was referring to a creature of fiction, a pagan entity, or possibly a demon. But then the names shifted reference once he encountered the heretical Christians in his neighborhood and the Jews in his neighborhood, and he decided oh, actually what I should say is, it's the same God you all are talking about. Here are some new revelations from that same God you're talking about. Once he made that decision, it seems like he might have joined their name-using practice and thereby referred to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it could have been that the name shifted reference even for Muhammad from a fiction to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Seems like the moon god argument here backfires on both Judaism and Christianity, since the names of God, Yahweh, El Elyon, all of these are Canaanite deities that predate any divine revelation of the Israelites. And we know that historically as a matter of fact when we look at Canaanite mythology. So to me, it seems like a very hypocritical argument that ends up backfiring on both Jews and every type of Christian. So I think that whenever those arguments are employed, I don't find them very consistent. Maybe I think an atheist could employ that argument, but I for the life of me, don't see how a Jew or Christian could. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'm not a historian, but I have also heard that the very ancient Israelites were some kind of polytheists, worshiping pagan entities or something, and borrowing names from the surrounding area, and then somehow they glommed onto the one true God. And I think probably what happened as a historical matter of fact is they used old words and then shifted reference those words to the one true God. That can easily happen.
Even if the Israelites didn't worship other gods, let's say the Israelites were always monotheists, we still know that there are
borrowed names.
Yeah, we still know that there's deities with those exact same names that predate divine revelation.
Yeah, I was just thinking if you went back way before Abraham or something. I guess they probably were. There was a lot of pagan worship going on, a lot of polytheism going on. But whatever the historical facts were, it may well have been that Israelites borrowed divine names from their neighborhood, the reference of those divine names. And that's what I was suggesting might have happened with Muhammad as well, even if originally he was using divine names to refer to either fictional objects or demons or something like that. Once he made the decision and formed the intention, actually I want to refer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he may have done that. Yeah, he may have shifted the reference of the divine names. Yeah, so I don't think it's any barrier, even pointing out that Islam arose in a polytheistic pagan context. That is not an insuperable obstacle for the conclusion that nevertheless Muslims, when they use the divine names, are referring to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah. I think we grabbed everything there from the chat. This has been incredibly fascinating. I really enjoyed your PowerPoint presentation. I want to thank you for coming on and doing this. And by the way, you're always welcome to come back on anytime that you ever want. This was incredibly fascinating.
All right. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, and where can people go to learn more about you and your material?
If you just Google my name, I have an unusual name, Tomas Bogardus, and my professional website comes up, and all my papers are there. Also, follow me on Twitter if you want.
Absolutely, and I'll put a link, of course, to those in the show notes.
Right.
So everybody go and check it out. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. See you later. God bless.